September 3rd, 1942. The Berlin air was damp, thick with the smell of coal smoke and fear. Beyond the high stone walls of the Gestapo prison, the city moved with a dangerous rhythm. Factories churning, trains humming, soldiers marching, and civilians going about lives punctuated by whispers of terror. Inside the cell, Wilhelm "Will" Kohler sat alone on the narrow cot, his back pressed against the cold gray wall. Will's hands, roughened from months of labor and restraint, rested on his knees. The iron bars in front of him were thick, yet he stared past them, seeing not confinement, but opportunity. To most, he was just another prisoner, a man with no power, no leverage, trapped behind stone and steel. But Will had long learned that true influence was not measured by freedom, but by clarity, intelligence, and the ability to understand one's captors. He had been a linguist, a historian, someone who could read patterns in texts and human behavior alike. Before his capture, he had traversed occupied Europe carrying messages, coordinating intelligence, and exposing Nazi vulnerabilities to the Allies. His network had been extensive, but a betrayal led him here, to this cell, where every moment could be fatal. Yet in his mind, freedom existed. Every observation, every routine, every interaction was being recorded and analyzed. Outside, the world was in turmoil. The Eastern Front consumed soldiers by the thousands. The Atlantic convoys wavered under constant threat. Within Germany, Hitler's generals planned, strategized, confident in their superiority. They did not yet realize that in a dimly lit prison cell, a single mind was preparing to reach them, to speak to them, and to sow seeds of doubt that might alter their calculations. Will's first days were spent quietly watching. Guards moved in patterns, precise, rehearsed, predictable. Meals were delivered at exact times. Footsteps echoed down corridors in rhythmic sequences. He noted every detail. Which guards were loyal, which were ambitious, which feared authority. Each observation was data, each pattern a potential lever for influence. He began subtle tests, a book placed slightly askew, a small remark about the weather, a deliberate delay in responding to a question. He watched reactions closely, noting shifts in posture, eye movement, and speech cadence. These small experiments allowed him to map the psychology of those around him, understanding who could be approached, who could be influenced, and who posed danger. He also had to maintain appearances. He could not allow guards to suspect his intelligence or intentions. He played the part of the resigned scholar, a man beaten down by fate. Yet behind calm eyes, he calculated, planned, and rehearsed. Every whispered remark, every glance, every gesture became a message carefully crafted to reach beyond the walls. News of the war trickled in through whispers, smuggled notes, and briefings from sympathetic prisoners. Each fragment of information was analyzed. Will mapped movements of armies, supply lines, and the dispositions of German forces. He began to see vulnerabilities, not just in the physical realm, but in the minds of Hitler's generals. Arrogance, overconfidence, and a blindness to the human cost of their strategies. These were the levers he would exploit. By the end of the second week, Will had mentally constructed dialogues he would have with high-ranking officers. He imagined their postures, their defenses, the questions they would pose. He rehearsed answers that were subtle enough to provoke thought without arousing suspicion. Every gesture in the cell became practice. How to tilt his head, how to modulate his voice, how to phrase a question so that it lingered in the mind of the listener. He also kept meticulous notes in his mind. Names, ranks, observed behaviors, the tiniest details that might later allow him access to generals' confidence. He catalogued every observation with precision, knowing that memory, sharpened by necessity, would be his most powerful tool. Weeks passed. Guards began to notice a change. Will remained calm under circumstances that would have shattered ordinary men. Rumors started. The prisoner who spoke little, yet whose gaze seemed to pierce through the iron bars. Curiosity had begun to replace fear, the first subtle crack in the structure of his confinement. By the end of Section 1, tension was high. Will had not yet left his cell, but he was already moving invisible threads across the prison, preparing to influence men far above his station. The story was set. A scholar, prisoner, and covert operative, whose intellect and courage would soon bring him face to face with the very generals who shaped the war. The Dialogue with Power. October 7, 1942. The morning light filtered through the narrow slits of the interrogation chamber, casting long, angular shadows across the polished wood and stone. Wilhelm Will Kohler stepped forward, hands restrained, but head held high. Outside, the corridors were alive with footsteps and murmured commands, a world still unaware that the man they had deemed a prisoner would soon influence the decisions of generals who shaped Europe's destiny. The room was stark, its cold walls reflecting the precision and discipline of the Nazi hierarchy. Seated at the long oak table were three high-ranking officers, faces sharp, eyes cold, hands resting lightly on meticulously polished surfaces. Hitler's generals, the men who had orchestrated campaigns across the continent, whose strategies had sent thousands to death, and whose confidence seemed unshakable. Will's entrance drew measured glances. He observed everything: posture, the subtle twitch of fingers, the pattern of their breathing, even the faintest flicker in the eyes. Every detail became a note in his internal ledger. He had spent weeks in confinement preparing for this very moment, rehearsing phrases, visualizing arguments, calculating every risk and opportunity. The senior general, a man with steel-gray hair and an air of authority, leaned forward. "Kohler," he said, voice cold and deliberate, "you claim to have information that concerns the Reich. Speak, or you will remain in this cell indefinitely." Will inhaled steadily, calm, measured. "I speak only the truth," he began, his voice steady yet compelling. "And the truth will reach beyond these walls whether you hear it or not. But here, now, you have the opportunity to understand it, to use it before it reaches others in ways you cannot control." A flicker of surprise crossed one of the younger generals' faces. The other two exchanged guarded glances. Will continued, weaving words carefully, revealing just enough to challenge their assumptions without arousing suspicion. He spoke of vulnerabilities in supply lines, of overextended divisions, and of intelligence the Allies had already begun to gather. He did not boast, he framed the facts as neutral, almost academic, yet each sentence carried weight, sowing doubt in minds accustomed to unquestioned certainty. For over an hour he spoke, his words precise, deliberate, and anchored in evidence. The generals interjected, at first challenging, then questioning, and finally listening. Will used their responses, adjusting tone, timing, and emphasis. He was a conductor, orchestrating a subtle symphony of doubt, insight, and revelation. At moments, tension crackled like static in the air. A sharp question, a veiled accusation, a pause pregnant with threat. Yet Will remained composed, maintaining authority not through force, but through intellect, poise, and understanding of human nature. Every pause, every glance, every syllable was designed to leave a lingering impression. Hours turned into a full day, The generals debated among themselves, sometimes in whispers, sometimes with raised voices, all under the subtle guidance of the information Will had carefully presented. He watched not just their words, but their reactions, the tightening of jaws, the shifting of eyes, the small involuntary signs of uncertainty. These were his victories, invisible yet profound. By evening, the session concluded. Will was led back to his cell, yet he carried with him an awareness of impact. The generals, once certain of their supremacy, now entertained doubts. They had glimpsed cracks in their own armor, reflections of vulnerabilities they had not considered. Will's mission was not complete, but the seed had been planted. In the following weeks, Will's interactions became more sophisticated. Guards, once indifferent, now treated him with cautious respect. Couriers and aides, aware of his intellect, began to relay messages indirectly, opening channels he had only imagined. He used these conduits to feed subtle, strategic insights, guiding decisions, delaying movements, and occasionally saving lives, all while remaining officially a prisoner. Will's mental and emotional resilience was tested daily. The pressure of secrecy, the constant threat of discovery, and the moral weight of influencing men capable of immense destruction bore heavily upon him. Yet he remained unbroken, drawing strength from the knowledge that even in captivity, a single voice, intelligently applied, could shift the course of events among the highest echelons of power. By the end of Section 2, the narrative tension had reached its peak. Will Kohler had moved from silent observation to active, subtle manipulation. The story had showcased his ingenuity, courage, and the extraordinary capacity of a single human mind to affect the decisions of men in power, all from within a confined cell. The Whispers That Shaped History. March 15, 1943. The Berlin prison had grown colder as winter dragged on, frost creeping through cracks in the stone. Yet within the walls, the mind of Wilhelm "Will" Kohler burned brighter than ever. Months of observation, subtle communication, and carefully calculated interactions had borne fruit. The generals who once dismissed him as insignificant now carried the echoes of his words into decisions that could tilt campaigns, delay offensives, and save countless lives. From his narrow cot, Will reflected on the nature of influence. Power, he had realized, was not always wielded with fists or firepower. Often it was the quiet, precise application of intellect that created the most profound effect. A carefully chosen word, a pointed observation, a strategic silence, these were his weapons, sharper than any blade or bullet. And now, as he felt the subtle shifts in the Nazi command, he understood the true scope of his role. A single man, seemingly trapped, could change the behavior of an entire hierarchy. The ripple effect of his influence became increasingly evident. Orders were delayed, campaigns reconsidered, and minor hesitations began to appear in operations that had previously been executed with relentless precision. Soldiers in the field felt subtle shifts in strategy. Commanders in remote offices encountered unexpected pauses or changes in intelligence. All of this traced back, indirectly, to the conversations Will had initiated, to the doubts he had carefully planted, and to the strategic clarity he had provided from his cell. Will also observed the human cost of war with keen awareness. Letters smuggled from occupied territories, whispers of resistance networks, and brief interactions with fellow prisoners revealed the magnitude of suffering and resilience. He recorded these in memory, each story adding to his understanding of the human condition, each account sharpening the urgency of his mission. Knowledge, he realized, was only meaningful when it served life, not death. In quiet moments, he considered the moral weight of his actions. He had to navigate a delicate balance, providing insight that might protect some while knowing others would inevitably face destruction. Every statement, every nuance of expression carried consequences beyond the prison walls. Yet he remained committed to the principle that intelligence and foresight could guide humanity away from the most catastrophic outcomes, even when working within the machinery of a brutal regime. By summer, Will had established a network of subtle communication through sympathetic officers, couriers, and select guards. Each conduit allowed him to deliver observations, insights, and recommendations that were implemented with discretion. Though officially a prisoner, his reach extended far beyond the cell, into war rooms, strategy sessions, and conversations among men who once believed themselves untouchable. The psychological warfare he waged was as important as the physical maneuvers of armies. Hitler's generals, now wrestling with the dissonance of their assumptions and Will's revelations, found themselves questioning previous certainties. The arrogance and overconfidence that had characterized their leadership began to erode, replaced by caution and a grudging respect for an unseen adversary who had never held a weapon. Outside Berlin, the war continued to rage. Battles raged across Eastern Europe, in North Africa, and over the Atlantic. Yet, in subtle ways, the course of campaigns had shifted. Delayed offensives, revised troop movements, and a cautious approach to resource allocation could all be traced, in part, to the intellectual pressure Will had applied from his confined vantage point. He had become a ghost in the machinery of war, unseen but profoundly felt. Months turned to a year. Will's actions, carefully documented in his mind and discreet notes, became legendary among the select few who understood their significance. He was recognized, quietly, as a man whose intellect had carved paths of life through the chaos of death. His courage was not measured in confrontations or heroic charges, but in the silent, unwavering application of strategic thinking under immense pressure. By the spring of 1944, as Allied forces prepared for major operations, the culmination of Will's influence could be measured in tangible outcomes. Units that might have been annihilated received timely intelligence. Operations that could have led to catastrophic loss were reconsidered, and morale, subtly influenced, began to shift in favor of resilience rather than despair. His impact was not celebrated in public headlines, not recorded in propagandistic dispatches, yet it was no less real. Will's legacy within the prison walls was equally profound. Fellow prisoners found inspiration in his resolve, learning that intellect and patience could overcome even the harshest physical constraints. His calm, analytical demeanor became a beacon, proving that courage took many forms, and that even the most powerless could exert influence far beyond immediate circumstances. As Section 3 unfolds towards its conclusion, the story reflects on the broader lessons of history, the interplay of intellect and morality, the subtle ways in which individual actions can shape monumental events, and the enduring power of human courage and ingenuity. Will Kohler had transformed a prison cell into a command center of the mind, demonstrating that even in the darkest confinements, light could be cast and history could be touched by a single, determined voice. The final scenes of Section 3 focus on Will's reflections as the war progresses. Letters, whispered updates, and intelligence reports filter through. He contemplates the fragile balance between chance and strategy, bravery and patience, human weakness and resilience. Through his eyes, the audience witnesses both the immense machinery of war and the quiet power of one man's intellect navigating it. By the closing chapters, Will remains in the prison,
Yet his influence has rippled outward like unseen waves. The generals who once saw him as inconsequential now carry echoes of his counsel, deliberating with caution, facing doubts, and occasionally altering the course of operations. Lives have been saved, strategies reconsidered, and the moral weight of informed action demonstrated. In the final moments, the narrative zooms out. The Berlin cell, the echoing footsteps, the iron bars, all juxtaposed against the sweeping panorama of war-torn Europe. Will's silent triumph is complete. A scholar in chains has moved mountains, not with force, but with mind, courage, and an unyielding grasp of human psychology. His story closes on a note of awe, reflection, and the profound reminder that history often bends under the quiet, strategic influence of those who dare to think, observe, and act even from behind iron bars.